The sprawling estate of Gregory Roberts sat atop the highest hill in Silver Creek, a prestigious enclave just outside of Seattle. To the outside world, the glass and steel mansion was a monument to success. A testament to the billion-dollar software empire Gregory had built from the ground up before he turned 30. But to those who lived inside its climate-controlled walls, it was a fortress of solitude, a golden cage where silence was not a luxury, but a heavy, suffocating blanket that covered everything. Gregory, a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms and solving complex algorithmic problems, found himself utterly powerless against the quiet that plagued his home. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his study, a cold cup of coffee in his hand, looking down at the manicured lawn where his 3 daughters were playing. Amanda Nelson, Stephanie Carter, and Caroline Mitchell were 4 years old. They were identical in every way, with the same chestnut curls falling over their shoulders and the same piercing blue eyes that seemed to hold a wisdom far beyond their tender years. They were physically perfect, their health records unblemished, their hearing sharp enough to detect the sound of a wrapper opening from 3 rooms away. Yet, in 4 years, not a single intelligible word had escaped their lips. There had been no data, no mama, no cries for milk, no giggles of delight that formed into sentences. There was only silence. It wasn't that they couldn't make noise. They simply chose not to. They communicated with each other through a complex, eerie system of subtle glances, hand squeezes, and blinks that no adult could decipher. It was a silent pact, a fortress within a fortress, and Gregory was on the outside looking in. The death of his wife, Marie Turner, during childbirth had been the tragedy that started it all, or so the psychologists claimed. They said the girls had absorbed the trauma in the womb, or that Gregory's grief had created a nonverbal environment. He had hired the best speech pathologists from New York, child behavioral specialists from London, and even a spiritual healer from Sydney. They all left with the same diagnosis: selective mutism, profound and impenetrable. The girls understood everything but refused to participate in the world of sound. Gregory felt like he was failing them every single day. He watched them now, sitting in a circle on the grass, passing a wooden block between them with solemn faces, looking more like a secret society meeting than a playdate. The silence of the morning was broken not by a child's voice, but by the heavy, rhythmic rumble of a diesel engine. A bright red fire truck, engine 42, rolled slowly up the long, winding driveway of the estate. It wasn't an emergency. It was the annual fire safety inspection and brush clearance check required for all properties bordering the national forests. Gregory sighed, placing his coffee on the mahogany desk. He had forgotten about the appointment. He rubbed his temples, dreading the intrusion of strangers, but he knew Captain Timothy White was a good man. Timothy had been the first responder of the night. Marie went into labor, the man who had tried to get them to the hospital through a blizzard. Gregory owed him a debt of gratitude that could never be repaid, even if the memory was laced with pain. Down on the lawn, the girls stopped their silent game. They stood up in unison, their identical dresses fluttering in the cool autumn breeze, and watched the massive machine come to a halt. Captain Timothy White jumped down from the cab, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel. He was a man of 40, with a face weathered by smoke and sun, and eyes that had seen too much but remained kind. He adjusted his helmet under his arm and waved at the girls. Usually, children would scream with excitement, run to the truck, ask to see the siren. The Roberts triplets merely stared, 3 pairs of unblinking eyes tracking his every move. Timothy offered a warm smile, but he knew the score. He knew about the silence. He gave him a respectful nod and walked toward the front door where Gregory was emerging. "Good to see you, Gregory," Timothy said, his voice a deep baritone that seemed to vibrate in the crisp air. "Sorry to intrude." Gregory shook his hand, the grip firm. "No intrusion, Timothy. You're the only visitor. I don't mind." "The girls?" Timothy looked over at Gregory's shoulder at the triplets. "They hadn't moved. They're getting big." Gregory, 4 already. Gregory looked tired. His shoulders slumped. "They're growing, Tim, but the house stays the same. Quiet as a tomb. I'd give every dime in the bank just to hear one of them shout at me in anger." As the 2 men walked toward the side of the house to inspect the water access, something shifted in the atmosphere. The girls, usually tethered to the center of the lawn, began to drift toward the massive wrought iron gates that separated the estate from the public road. The gates were closed, of course, monitored by cameras and sensors, but something on the other side had caught their attention. Gregory didn't notice at first, engrossed in explaining a new irrigation system to Timothy. It was Timothy who stopped mid. "Gregory," he said, pointing a gloved hand. Amanda, Steffi, and Caroline were pressed against the iron bars of the gate, their small hands gripping the cold metal, their faces pushed through the gaps. They were transfixed. On the other side of the road, sitting on a weathered public bench near the bus stop, sat a woman who looked like she carried the weight of the world in her layers of mismatched clothes. She was elderly, her hair a chaotic halo of silver frizzy curls escaping from a woolen beanie. She wore a coat that had seen better decades, patched with different fabrics, and beside her sat a majestic, albeit slightly muddy, golden retriever wearing a red bandana. This was Ruth Jackson. To the residents of Silver Creek, Ruth was an eyesore, a vagrant who had recently appeared in the neighborhood, collecting cans and sitting quietly on public benches. To the Triplets, she appeared to be something else entirely. Gregory felt a surge of protective panic. "I need to get him," he said, stepping forward. "That woman..." But Timothy held out an arm, gently stopping him. "Wait," Timothy whispered, his firefighter's instinct for observation kicking in. "Just watch." Ruth wasn't asking for money. She wasn't yelling. She was sitting perfectly still, looking directly at the Triplets. Slowly, with a grace that belied her age and appearance, she lifted her hand. She didn't wave. Instead, she formed a shape with her fingers, a specific, deliberate movement. She tapped her chin, then moved her hand away. Then she placed her hand over her heart and moved it in a circular motion. It wasn't random gesticulation. It was language. Gregory squinted. Is she casting a spell? But Timothy was already stepping closer, his eyes narrowing in recognition. "She's communicating, Gregory. That's sign language." But it was the girl's reaction that froze the blood in Gregory's veins. For the first time in 4 years, the fortress cracked. Amanda let go of the bars. She mimicked the motion. She tapped her chin. Then Stephanie did the same. And finally, Carolyn, the most withdrawn of the three, raised her hand and awkwardly but clearly made the sign for please. Gregory gasped, the sound loud in the quiet driveway. "Did you see that?" they responded. Timothy was already moving, not toward the house, but toward the gate. "Open it," Gregory and Timothy commanded, his voice losing its casual tone and taking on the authority of a scene commander. Gregory fumbled for the remote in his pocket, his hands trembling. The heavy iron gates groaned and swung open. The girls didn't run away. They didn't run back to their father. They took 3 synchronized steps forward, crossing the boundary of the estate, and stopped 5 feet away from the homeless woman and her dog. Ruth smiled then. It wasn't the toothless, crazy grin Gregory had feared. It was a smile of infinite warmth, of sad understanding. She reached into her oversized coat pocket and pulled out not a weapon, not a flask, but 3 small, worn puppets made of old socks. She slipped one onto her hand, and instead of speaking to the girls, she made the puppet look at them. And then a sound came from the woman. It wasn't a raspy voice. She began to hum. A low, melodic melody, something classical, perhaps Mozart or Bach, pitch perfect and soothing. The effect was instantaneous. The tension in the girls' shoulders dropped. They stepped closer, drawn by the music like moths to a flame. The dog wagged its tail, thumping a rhythm against the pavement. Timothy walked up beside Gregory, who was paralyzed with shock. "I know that woman," Timothy murmured. More to himself than to Gregory, "I couldn't place her without the uniform, but I know that hum." Before Gregory could ask what he meant, a sleek black sedan screeched to a halt right in front of the bench, nearly clipping the curb. The window rolled down, and a sharp, stinging voice cut through the magical moment. "Gregory." It was Barbara Brown, the president of the Homeowners Association, a woman whose pearls cost more than most people as cars, and whose heart was seemingly made of the same cold stone as her driveway. She didn't even look at the miracle happening with the children. Her eyes were fixed on Ruth with pure venom. "I have called the police 3 times, Barbara spat, stepping out of the car, clutching her phone. "This vagrant is devaluing our properties, and now she's luring your children. Gregory, get those girls inside immediately." She marched toward Ruth, waving her phone like a weapon. "You need to leave. Now." Ruth flinched, the song dying in her throat. She pulled her hand back, hiding the sock puppet, shrinking into her coat as if trying to disappear. The girls, sensing the aggression, stepped back, the light in their eyes vanishing instantly, replaced by the familiar, dead stare. The connection was severed. Gregory felt a rage build in his chest he hadn't felt in years. But before he could speak, Timothy stepped between Barbara and the bench. "Back off, Barbara," Timothy warned, his voice low and dangerous. Barbara shrieked. "Look at her. She's filthy. She's probably carrying diseases." She turned to Gregory. The wood hung in the air. "Freaks." Gregory stepped forward, his fists clenched. But it was Caroline Little, silent Caroline, who reacted. She picked up a small stone from the driveway. Her face was contorted not in sadness, but in fury. She looked at Barbara, then at her father, and for a split second, Gregory saw her mouth open. A sound was forming. A scream. A word. The sound that escaped Caroline's throat was not a word, nor was it a scream. It was a guttural, jagged gasp, like a rusty hinge being forced open after years of disuse. The stone she held in her small hand didn't fly through the air to strike Barbara. Instead, it dropped to the pavement with a dull thud that echoed the sudden heaviness in Gregory's heart. The girl's face crumbled, the flash of anger dissolving instantly into a mask of terrified anguish, and she collapsed onto the asphalt, burying her face in her knees. Gregory moved faster than he ever had in his life. He scooped his daughter up, shielding her from the woman who had just verbally assaulted them, his body acting as a physical barrier against the toxicity of the outside world. He turned his back on Barbara, his eyes burning with a cold, protective fury as he looked at the Homeowners Association president over his shoulder. "Get off my property," Gregory said, his voice dropping to a register so low and menacing that it vibrated with the intensity of a growl. "If you ever speak to my children again, Barbara, if you even look in their direction, I will bury you under so much litigation that your grandchildren will still be paying legal fees. Get..." Barbara, brown turned a shade of pale, usually reserved for her old linen. She clutched her pearls, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but the look in Gregory's eyes and the imposing, silent figure of Captain Timothy White standing with his arms crossed next to the fire truck convinced her that this was a battle she had already lost, at least for the moment. She scrambled back into her black sedan, slamming the door with a violence that shook the chassis, and peeled away, her tires screeching an impotent threat against the asphalt. But as the car disappeared around the bend, the damage remained. The girls were trembling. The magical connection they had formed with the woman on the bench seemed to have shattered under the weight of Barbara's cruelty. Gregory held Caroline tight, while Amanda and Stephanie clung to his legs, burying their faces in his trousers. He looked towards the bench, expecting the homeless woman to have fled, frightened by the shouting and the threat of police. But Ruth hadn't moved. She sat frozen, a hand still hovering near the dog's head, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and profound sorrow. She wasn't looking at Gregory, though. She was looking at Timothy. The firefighter took a slow step toward the bench, removing his helmet completely this time, revealing his face fully to the morning light. He walked past the gate, past the boundary of the estate, and knelt on one knee directly in front of the homeless woman. "I know you," Timothy said softly, his voice cracking with an emotion Gregory couldn't place. "It's been 10 years, hasn't it? But I never forgot the eyes." The woman flinched as if he had struck her. She pulled her tattered coat tighter around herself, shaking her head vigorously, muttering unintelligible sounds, trying to shrink away from the recognition. No, just Ruth. Just nobody," she whispered, her voice rasping like dry leaves. Gregory, still holding his sobbing daughter, walked slowly toward them, confused. Timothy didn't look away from the woman. He looked up at Gregory, his expression grim and serious. "Gregory, this isn't just a homeless woman. 10 years ago, before I was a captain, I was a rookie in the downtown precinct. It was a boarding school for kids with severe communication traumas. The building was old, the fire moved fast. The director of that school ran back into the flames 4 times. She carried 6 children out on her back." Timothy paused, swallowing hard against the lump in his throat, but the roof collapsed before she could get to her own office, where her husband and daughter were waiting. She lost everything that night. Her family, her school, her mind. The city hailed her as a hero, but she vanished from the hospital before she could receive the medal. Everyone thought she had died or moved away, but she's been here. Gregory looked at the woman with new eyes. He didn't see the dirt on her face or the mismatched shoes anymore. He saw a woman who had walked through hell and paid the ultimate price. He saw a mother who had lost her voice because the grief was too loud to bear. And suddenly, the connection with his daughters made perfect, painful sense. They recognized a fellow survivor. They saw the silence in her, not as an emptiness, but as a language they shared. Gregory made a decision then, one that defied all logic and social protocol of Silver Creek. "Ruth," Gregory said, stepping closer, "my name is Gregory. These are my daughters, Amanda, Stephanie, and Caroline. We have a lot of food inside, and it's warm. Would you like to come in?" Ruth looked up, terror warring with longing in her eyes. She looked at the girls. Amanda and Stephanie had stopped crying. They had released Gregory's legs and were now standing a few feet away, staring at Ruth with that same intense curiosity as before. Slowly, Amanda extended her hand, palm open. It was an invitation. Ruth hesitated, her trembling hand reaching out to touch the girl's fingertips. The contact was electric. A sob broke from Ruth's chest, and she nodded, a jerky, fragile movement. She whispered, pointing to the golden retriever. Gregory nodded, tears stinging his own eyes. Barnaby, too. The procession that walked up the driveway of the Roberts estate was unlike anything Silver Creek had ever seen. A billionaire, a firefighter, 3 silent little girls, a homeless woman in rags, and a muddy dog. Inside the mansion, the staff were horrified but silent at Gregory's sharp glance. He led Ruth not to the kitchen or the servants' quarters, but to the main living room, with its white velvet sofas and Persian rugs. He didn't care about the mud. He didn't care about the smell. He ordered tea, sandwiches, and warm soup. Timothy stayed, radioing his station that he was delayed on a community outreach call, while Ruth ate, devouring the sandwich with a heartbreaking voracity. The girls sat on the floor around her, watching her every move. After the food, a transformation occurred. Ruth wiped her mouth with a linen napkin, took a deep breath, and seemed to shed the layer of the crazy homeless woman like a heavy coat. She sat up straighter. Her eyes cleared. She looked at the triplets, not with pity, but with professional assessment. She didn't speak to them in English. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the sock puppets again. She put one on her hand and one on Barnaby's paw. She began to hum that melody again, a complex, weaving tune that sounded like a lullaby from a forgotten country. She moved her hands in rhythm, mixing standard sign language with fluid pantomime movements. She pointed to the window, then to the girls, then to her heart. Window, you, heart. Gregory watched from the doorway, breathless. Timothy stood beside him. Watch, Timothy whispered. She's checking their cognitive engagement. For an hour, the room was filled only with her humming and the soft sounds of the girls moving. They were mimicking her. They were laughing silent, breathless laughs, but laughs nonetheless. Then, Ruth stopped. She leaned forward, her face inches from Caroline's. She placed her hand on her own throat, letting Caroline feel the vibration of the hum. Then she placed Caroline's hand on her own little throat. Ruth opened her mouth and articulated a sound, slowly, clearly. She waited. She didn't push. She just waited with infinite patience. Caroline looked at her sisters. They nodded, a imperceptible micro-movement of encouragement. Caroline looked at Gregory, who was holding his breath until his lungs burned. She looked back at Ruth. She closed her eyes, her small brow furrowing in concentration. She opened her mouth. The silence of the room was thick, heavy, pressing down on them. And then it broke. Caroline whispered. It was faint, dry, barely a breath, but it was there. Morar, Artha, she finished, trying to say the original name she heard, or perhaps simply struggling with sound. Wait, Timothy had called her Ruth? Caroline tried again. Gregory fell to his knees. The cup of coffee he had been holding on the side table rattled, but he didn't hear it. He heard the most beautiful sound in the universe. His daughter had spoken. Ruth, Steffe whispered next. Ruth Amanda echoed, her voice higher, sweeter. 3 voices, 3 words. After 4 years of silence, the dam had broken. Gregory crawled across the expensive rug and wrapped his arms around his daughters, weeping openly, unashamed. Ruth watched them, tears streaming down her soot-stained cheeks, her hand resting on Barnabas' head. For the first time in 10 years, she felt the ice around her heart begin to crack. She had saved them, and in saving them, she had remembered who she was. But the moment a miracle was shattered by the harsh, alternating wail of sirens, not a fire truck this time, police sirens, and the darker, heavier tone of an ambulance. Blue and red lights flashed against the high windows, painting the room in a strobe of panic. The front door burst open. The staff hadn't locked it after Timothy entered. Barbara Brown marched in, but she wasn't alone this time. She was flanked by 2 uniformed police officers and a stern-looking woman wearing a badge that read Child Protective Services. Barbara shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at Ruth. who recoiled into the sofa, the light in her eyes extinguishing instantly as terror took over. I told you. He has a deranged transient in the house with the children. Look at the filth. Look at the animal. The CPS officer stepped forward, her face unreadable but her eyes scanning the scene: the crying father on the floor, the homeless woman on the velvet sofa, the large dog. Mr. Roberts, the officer said, her voice clipped and professional. We received a report of immediate danger to the welfare of minors. I need you to step away from the children. Gregory scrambled to his feet, placing himself between the police and Ruth. No, you don't understand. She made him speak. But the officers were already moving, reaching for Ruth's arms. Ruth didn't fight. She went limp, a trauma response, her eyes rolling back as she disassociated from the reality. Please, she whispered. I didn't steal anything. She was slipping back into the nightmare of her past. Timothy stepped forward, his imposing size blocking one of the officers. Timothy barked, using his command voice. Step aside, Captain, or I'll arrest you for obstruction, the officer warned, hand resting on his taser. Barbara stood in the background, a triumphant, cruel smile twisting her lips. Take her away, she hissed, and maybe take the girls to... The triplets began to scream, not silent screams this time, but loud, piercing shrieks of terror as they saw their new friend being... The sound was deafening, a chaotic symphony of breakthrough and breakdown. Gregory looked at his daughter screaming, then at Ruth being dragged away, and he knew that the war for his family had just begun. The living room of the Roberts estate had transformed into a battleground of conflicting authorities, shouting voices, and the heartbreaking cries of three little girls who had found their voices only to scream in terror. Gregory stood his ground, physically blocking the path of the police officers who were attempting to haul Ruth away like a sack of refuse. His heart was hammering against his ribs, not with the panic of a victim, but with the cold, calculated adrenaline of a father protecting his pack. He saw the fear in Ruth's eyes, a deep, ancient terror that went beyond the current moment, a flashback to a life of persecution and loss. He saw the smug satisfaction on Barbara's face, a woman who wielded order like a weapon to destroy anything she couldn't control, and he saw his daughters clinging to each other, their faces wet with tears, screaming the name of the woman who had unlocked their prison. Gregory roared, a sound so authoritative that it momentarily silenced the room. He didn't look like the reclusive tech billionaire anymore. He looked like a titan. Officer, if you take one more step with that woman, you will be making the biggest mistake of your career. I am Gregory Roberts. I own this town's digital infrastructure. I fund the police pension program, and I have the best civil rights lawyers in the state on speed dial. This woman is my guest. She is the private tutor of my children. The officers hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. The power dynamic had shifted, but Barbara wasn't done. She screeched, her composure cracking. She's a vagrant, a trespasser. She's mentally unstable. Look at her. She's filthy. The CPS agent, Deborah Harris, stepped forward, her face stern. Mr. Roberts, the cleanliness of the home and the presence of an potentially dangerous transient are serious red flags. If you are employing her, where is her paperwork? Gregory opened his mouth to lie, to invent a paperwork trail that didn't exist, but he was cut off, not by Timothy, and not by his lawyers. She is double quotes